Naddaha, the haunting siren. Picture this. You're walking alone at night near the Nile River. The air is thick with moisture and ancient whispers. Suddenly, you hear it. A voice. The most beautiful voice you've ever heard, calling your name with impossible sweetness. Every fiber of your being screams at you to turn back, but your feet betray you. They move toward the water, toward her. And once you see her face reflected in those dark waters, you'll never be seen again. Tonight, I'm taking you deep into one of Egypt's most terrifying legends. The story of Naddaha, the siren of the Nile, who has claimed countless victims for over a century. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll never look at rivers the same way again. For thousands of years, the Nile River has been the lifeblood of Egypt. It's brought prosperity, civilization, and sustenance to millions. But like all great forces of nature, the Nile has a darker side. A side that rural Egyptians have whispered about for generations, usually after sunset, when the river mist rolls in and visibility drops to almost nothing. They speak of Naddaha, which translates directly to the caller. She's not just some campfire story parents tell to keep children away from dangerous waters. This is a legend that has persisted with remarkable consistency across different villages, different generations, and different centuries. In tonight's deep dive, we're going to explore everything about this haunting figure. Where did she come from? What does she want? Why does she target men specifically? We'll examine documented accounts of disappearances, analyze the psychological and cultural significance of this legend, and uncover why Naddaha remains one of the most chilling figures in Middle Eastern folklore. We'll also look at the striking similarities between Naddaha and other water spirits from around the world, and what that tells us about the human psyche and our ancient relationship with water. But here's what makes this story particularly unsettling. Unlike many myths that fade with modernization, reports of Naddaha encounters haven't stopped. Even in recent decades, people claim to have heard her call. So stick with me until the very end, because the final account I'm sharing will absolutely send chills down your spine. Let's start at the beginning. Who exactly is Naddaha? According to Egyptian folklore, she's a supernatural female entity, often described as a naiad or water spirit, who dwells along the banks of the Nile. But she's not just any spirit. She's a predator with a very specific method and a very specific type of victim. Naddaha appears most commonly during the evening hours or late at night, when men are walking alone near the river, fishermen returning from a long day's work, farmers are taking a shortcut home, young men seeking solitude by the water's edge. These are her preferred targets. The encounter always begins the same way. A voice. Witnesses describe it as the most enchanting, melodious sound they've ever heard. It's feminine, sweet, almost impossibly beautiful. And here's the truly disturbing part. The voice calls out the victim's name. Not a generic call or a random sound. Your actual name, spoken with such familiarity and affection that you're convinced someone you know and love is calling for you. Imagine hearing your mother's voice, or your wife's voice, or your sister's voice coming from the darkness near the river. Your rational mind might tell you something's wrong, but your emotional response is immediate and overwhelming. You have to investigate. You have to help whoever is calling you. As the victim approaches the water, the voice continues to call, always staying just out of sight, always drawing the person closer to the river's edge. Some accounts describe seeing a figure in the mist, a woman of extraordinary beauty, with long flowing hair and an almost luminescent quality to her skin. She might be combing her hair by the water or standing knee-deep in the current, beckoning with graceful gestures. Her beauty is so overwhelming that victims become completely mesmerized, losing all sense of caution or self-preservation. And then, according to the legend, one of two things happens. Either the victim walks directly into the water, disappearing beneath the surface never to return, or Naddaha herself drags them down into the depths. But here's where the legend gets even more disturbing. Sometimes, the victims' bodies are never found. The Nile simply swallows them whole, leaving behind only confusion and grief. Other times, bodies are discovered days or weeks later, washed up on distant riverbanks, often with expressions of terror frozen on their faces. And in some of the most chilling versions of the tale, victims are found drowned with no water in their lungs, as if they died of fright before they even hit the water. Local communities have developed their own explanations for why Naddaha does what she does. Some say she's a vengeful spirit, a woman who was wronged by men in life and now seeks eternal revenge. Others believe she's collecting souls to ease her own loneliness in the afterlife. Now you might be thinking this is just another folklore creature, a boogeyman story with no real substance. But Naddaha's legend is deeply woven into the fabric of Egyptian rural culture, and understanding why requires us to look at the historical relationship between Egyptians and the Nile. For over 5,000 years, Egyptian civilization has been entirely dependent on this river. The annual flooding brought nutrient-rich silt that made agriculture possible in an otherwise desert landscape. Communities were built along its banks. Commerce, transportation, drinking water, fishing, and bathing. Everything revolved around the Nile. But with all that dependence came very real danger. The Nile is not a gentle river. Its currents can be deceptively strong. Its depths hide submerged objects, sudden drop-offs, and treacherous undertows. Throughout history, drowning has been a common cause of death in riverside communities. Before modern safety measures and a better understanding of water safety, the loss of life to the river was a regular tragedy. Imagine being a family in the 18th or 19th century. Your son or husband leaves for work in the morning, takes a route along the river, and simply never comes home. Nobody is found. No explanation exists. The river has taken another victim, and you're left with nothing but questions and grief. This is where folklore steps in to fill the gap that logic cannot address. Naddaha became a way to explain the unexplainable. She transformed random tragedy into a narrative that made sense within the cultural framework. It wasn't just bad luck or a misstep that claimed your loved one. It was a supernatural entity, a force beyond human control. In a strange way, this provided comfort. It gave meaning to meaningless loss. It also served an extremely practical purpose. By creating a terrifying legend associated with the river, communities developed a powerful tool for keeping people, especially children and young men, away from dangerous areas, particularly at night when visibility was poor and help was far away. The specific targeting of men in the legend is particularly interesting from a sociological perspective. In traditional Egyptian rural society, men were the ones most likely to work near the river, to fish in it, to travel along it at all hours. They were the demographic most at risk of drowning. By creating a feminine supernatural threat that specifically hunted men, the folklore directly addressed the actual pattern of drowning victims. It's a brilliant example of how mythology reflects and responds to real-world dangers. The legend also draws on much older Egyptian religious and mythological traditions. Ancient Egypt had numerous deities and spirits associated with the Nile. Hapi, the god of the annual flooding. Sobuk, the crocodile god who represented both the fertility and the danger of the river. The concept of the Nile as a living entity, something with its own will and appetite, is ancient. Naddaha can be seen as a folk evolution of these older beliefs, a way that common people maintained a spiritual relationship with the river after the old religion faded. The feminine aspect of Naddaha also connects to ancient archetypes. Across Egyptian mythology, powerful female figures appear repeatedly. Isis, Hathor, Sekhmet. Female divinity was associated with both creation and destruction, nurturing and vengeance. Naddaha embodies this duality perfectly. She's beautiful and alluring, like the life-giving aspects of the Nile. But she's also deadly and merciless, like the river's power to destroy. Now here's where things get really fascinating. Naddaha is not unique. When we examine water spirit legends from around the world, we find remarkably similar figures across completely different cultures that had no contact with each other. This tells us something profound about human psychology and our universal relationship with water. Let's start with the most famous comparison, the Sirens of Greek mythology. You probably know the story from Homer's Odyssey. Sirens were dangerous creatures who lured sailors to their deaths with irresistible songs. Odysseus had to have himself tied to the mast of his ship, and his crew blocked their ears with wax to safely pass their island. The parallels to Naddaha are striking. Both use beautiful voices as their primary weapon. Both target men specifically. Both are associated with water and drowning. Both represent the danger of succumbing to temptation. Then we have the Germanic and Scandinavian nixies and neck. These are freshwater spirits that inhabit rivers and lakes throughout northern Europe. They're often described as beautiful women who appear near water and lure people, especially young men, to drown. The neck in particular is known for its enchanting music, playing violin or harp by the water's edge, drawing victims close before pulling them under. The Scottish and Irish have their own version called the Bean or the washerwoman. This spirit is often seen washing bloody clothes by a stream, and encountering her is an omen of death. While not identical to Naddaha, she shares the association with water, the feminine form, and the connection to death. In Slavic folklore, we find the rusalka. These are the spirits of young women who died by drowning or by suicide in water, and they return as vengeful entities who entice men into the water to share their fate. They're described as extraordinarily beautiful with long green hair, and they dance and sing to attract victims. Japan has its own water spirits called the kappa and the more directly comparable yukiana, though the yukiana is associated with snow rather than rivers. However, Japanese folklore also includes tales of spirits dwelling in rivers and ponds who interact dangerously with humans. Latin American folklore gives us La Llorona, the weeping woman. While her story has different origins, involving the loss of her children, she haunts waterways and is known for a distinctive calling or crying sound that draws people, particularly children, toward water where they may drown. Even in West African folklore, we find Mami Wata, a water spirit often depicted as a beautiful woman, sometimes with a fish tail, who can bring fortune or disaster to those who encounter her. She's associated with rivers, lakes, and the ocean, and relationships with her are described as dangerous and unpredictable. What's remarkable is that these legends emerged independently in cultures separated by thousands of miles and centuries of history. So why this universal pattern? The answer lies in human psychology and our ancient relationship with water. First, water is essential for life, but it's also one of nature's most dangerous elements. Throughout human history, drowning has been a leading cause of death. Our ancestors needed ways to teach their children and community members to respect and fear water's dangers. Creating supernatural guardians or predators associated with water was an effective method of cultural education. Second, water has unique sensory and psychological properties. The sound of flowing water, especially at night, can create auditory illusions. The way mist and darkness interact with water can produce visual effects that seem supernatural. Reflections can distort and create the appearance of figures that aren't really there. Human brains are wired for pattern recognition, and in low-light conditions near water, we often perceive faces and forms in random visual noise. Third, The feminine archetype in these legends speaks to deep psychological associations. Water is often symbolically linked with femininity in human cultures. The womb, birth, fluidity, emotion, mystery. These associations make a female water spirit feel psychologically right on an instinctive level. The seductive aspect taps into another universal theme: the danger of temptation. The beautiful woman who leads men to destruction appears in countless stories across cultures because it addresses a fundamental human experience: the conflict between rational self-preservation and irrational desire. Naddaha, like her counterparts worldwide, is a manifestation of this eternal struggle. Now let's move from mythology to something more concrete: actual accounts and reports. While we have to approach these with appropriate skepticism, the consistency and persistence of Naddaha encounters is noteworthy. Documented references to Naddaha go back well over a century in written form, though oral traditions certainly predate that significantly. In rural villages along the Nile, especially in Upper Egypt and the Delta region, asking older residents about Naddaha will almost certainly yield stories. Not just the legend itself, but personal accounts or stories about people they knew who had encounters. A common pattern in these accounts goes something like this. A man is walking alone at dusk or night near the river. He hears his name being called in a familiar voice. He recognizes it as his mother, his wife, or another female relative. He calls back, asking what's wrong, why they're by the river. The voice responds, sounding distressed or urgent, asking him to come quickly. As he approaches the water, he might catch a glimpse of a figure in white, or see long hair flowing in a wind that doesn't exist, or notice an impossibly beautiful face reflected in the water. At this point, some crucial detail breaks the spell. Perhaps a friend arrives and calls out to him. Perhaps a sudden noise startles him back to awareness. Perhaps his foot slips on the muddy bank, and the shock of almost falling jolts him to his senses. The man realizes he's standing at the very edge of the water, sometimes even with one foot in the current, with absolutely no memory of having walked there. The voice is gone. The figure has vanished. He's left shaking, terrified by how close he came to walking into the Nile. These near-miss accounts are common because the victims survived to tell the story, but they're always accompanied by darker tales of those who weren't so lucky. A fisherman who went to check his nets one evening and never returned. His boat was found empty the next morning. A young man who told his family he heard his deceased mother calling to him from the river and vanished that same night. A farmer was found drowned in shallow water, where drowning should have been nearly impossible. In each case, community members will tell you it was Naddaha. In more recent decades, as Egypt has modernized and many people have moved to cities, you might expect these stories to fade. But they haven't. Internet forums and social media groups dedicated to Egyptian folklore contain numerous posts from people claiming to have had experiences with Naddaha or knowing someone who did. One particularly detailed account from the early 2000s describes a university student who was visiting his family's village during a break. He was walking along a familiar path beside the Nile at sunset when he heard what sounded like his sister calling for help. He knew his sister was in Cairo, miles away, but the voice was so convincing that he found himself running toward the water. He described feeling like he was in a dream, unable to control his own body. Fortunately, his uncle had been following the same path and saw him running toward the river. The uncle shouted his name and grabbed him just as he was about to plunge into the water. The student said he snapped out of his trance-like state and realized he had no idea why he'd been running toward the water. The voice had completely vanished. Skeptics, and I include myself in this category for healthy analytical purposes, would point to rational explanations. Auditory hallucinations. The power of suggestion when someone is already familiar with the legend. Natural sounds like wind or water movement are being misinterpreted. The disorienting effects of darkness and isolation. The possibility that some supposed drownings attributed to El Naddaha were actually suicides, accidents, or even crimes, with the legend providing a convenient supernatural explanation. All of these are valid considerations. But here's what makes the El Naddaha phenomenon harder to dismiss entirely: the specificity and consistency of the accounts. People don't just report seeing a ghost or hearing strange sounds. They report the same sequence of events: the calling of their name, the familiar voice, the compulsion to approach the water, the trance-like state, the figure by the water. The fact that this pattern repeats across different time periods, different locations along the Nile, and among people who often claim they didn't even believe in the legend beforehand, suggests something more than simple fabrication. Whether that something is a genuine supernatural phenomenon, a consistent set of psychological and environmental factors that create similar experiences, or a deeply embedded cultural narrative that shapes how people interpret unusual events, remains an open question. What's undeniable is that for the people who have these experiences, they're absolutely real and absolutely terrifying. Let's dig deeper into the psychology behind the El Naddaha legend, because there's a lot more happening here than just a scary story. This legend taps into several fundamental human fears and psychological phenomena. First, there's the fear of water itself. Humans have a complex relationship with water. We're drawn to it. Coastal and riverside properties are highly valued. The sound of water is considered soothing. Yet water is also one of the most common settings for nightmares. Drowning is a primal fear because it combines helplessness, suffocation, and the unknown depths. Water is an alien environment for us. We can't breathe in it. We can't see clearly through it. We don't know what's beneath the surface. El Naddaha embodies this paradox. She's associated with the Nile, which gives life to Egypt, but she uses that same water as a weapon. Second, the legend exploits our vulnerability to familiar voices and the exploitation of trust. El Naddaha doesn't call victims with a strange voice that would immediately raise an alarm. She mimics the voices of loved ones, people you trust implicitly. This violation of trust is deeply disturbing. It suggests that nothing is safe, that even the voices of those closest to you can be weaponized against you. From a psychological perspective, this makes El Naddaha particularly insidious. She's not attacking you with obvious danger. She's manipulating your own emotional bonds and instincts to protect and respond to family members. Third, there's the element of compulsion and loss of free will. Victims in these stories describe being unable to control their own actions, moving toward the water despite internal protests. This taps into deep fears about losing autonomy, about being controlled by external forces. It's related to fears about possession, hypnosis, and manipulation. The trance-like state reported in El Naddaha encounters mirrors real psychological phenomena. Dissociative states can occur during times of stress, fatigue, or emotional disturbance. Highway hypnosis, where drivers suddenly realize they have no memory of the last several miles, is a well-documented example. In the context of someone walking alone at night in a potentially dangerous area, especially if they're tired or anxious, the brain might enter a similar state. Adding the cultural expectation of the El Naddaha legend could create a framework for interpreting this dissociative experience. Fourth, the legend addresses male vulnerability in a culture where men are expected to be strong and fearless. El Naddaha specifically targets men, and she defeats them not through physical force, but through seduction and psychological manipulation. This creates a space where men can acknowledge fear and vulnerability. It's culturally acceptable to admit you're afraid of a supernatural seductress in a way it might not be acceptable to admit you're simply afraid of drowning or making poor decisions. The sexual undertones of the legend are also significant. Naddaha is described as overwhelmingly beautiful. The act of being lured by her has seductive elements. This connects to broader themes in folklore about the dangers of female sexuality and male inability to resist temptation. From a feminist perspective, it's interesting that Naddaha is simultaneously powerful and objectified. She's a threat, but she's a threat specifically through her appearance and voice, traditionally feminine attributes. She has agency and power in the legend, but that power is still filtered through a male perspective of what makes women dangerous. Symbolically, Naddaha represents several broader concepts. The danger of nature, particularly in its most beautiful and alluring forms. The thin line between civilization and the wild. The price of transgression, whether that's going where you shouldn't go, being where you shouldn't be, or succumbing to temptation. She's also a guardian figure in a twisted sense. By making the river terrifying, she protects it. She keeps people from exploiting or disrespecting the water. Given how prevalent the Naddaha legend is in rural Egyptian culture, communities have developed various methods of protection and countermeasures. These folk practices are fascinating because they reveal the practical application of the legend and how it functions as a social control mechanism. The most basic and universal precaution is simple. Don't go near the river alone at night, especially if you're male. This is drilled into children from an early age. The river is for daytime, for groups, for necessary activities only. Evening and nighttime river visits are strongly discouraged. This practical wisdom, enforced through the Naddaha legend, has undoubtedly saved countless lives over the centuries by keeping people away from drowning hazards. If you must travel near the river after dark, traditional wisdom says to go in groups. Naddaha supposedly only targets isolated individuals. Having companions provides both practical safety and, according to the legend, supernatural protection. The presence of other people seems to break her power or dissuade her from attacking. Another common protective measure involves religious faith and symbols. Carrying a copy of the Quran, reciting specific prayers, or wearing religious amulets are believed to offer protection against Naddaha and other malevolent entities. The Islamic faith is deeply embedded in Egyptian culture, and religious protection against jinn and evil spirits is a well-established practice. Naddaha, while not necessarily classified as a jinn in the traditional sense, is often grouped with supernatural threats that religious faith can repel. Some traditions suggest that saying particular prayers or verses from the Quran aloud when you hear the calling can break the enchantment and drive Naddaha away. There are also folk remedies and talismans. Carrying iron or salt, substances traditionally believed to repel supernatural entities in many cultures. Wearing specific herbs or objects blessed by religious figures. Some communities believe that carrying something belonging to a living family member can prevent Naddaha from successfully mimicking their voice. If confronted by what might be Naddaha, traditional advice includes several strategies. Don't respond to voices calling your name from the river, no matter how familiar they sound. If you realize you're approaching the water in a trance-like state, bite your tongue or pinch yourself hard to break the enchantment. Physical pain is believed to disrupt supernatural influence. Call out loudly for help. Making noise supposedly disrupts Naddaha's concentration and may alert other people who can intervene. Most importantly, never look directly at her if you see a figure by the water. Eye contact is said to complete the enchantment and make escape impossible. These countermeasures serve multiple practical functions beyond any supernatural efficacy. They keep people alert and cautious near the water. They provide a sense of control in the face of danger. They reinforce community bonds and collective knowledge sharing. And they create a framework for behavior that increases safety even if you don't believe in the supernatural aspects. A person who avoids the river at night because they're afraid of El Naddaha is just as protected from drowning as someone who avoids it because they understand the dangers of poor visibility and strong currents. The outcome is the same. The reasoning might be different, but the practical result is increased safety. In contemporary Egypt, El Naddaha occupies an interesting space between traditional folklore and modern cultural expression. While urbanization and education have reduced literal belief in the legend among younger, city-dwelling Egyptians, El Naddaha remains a powerful cultural touchstone and has been adapted into various modern media. Egyptian literature has featured El Naddaha in numerous short stories and novels, often using her as a metaphor for broader themes: temptation and moral weakness, the conflict between tradition and modernity, the dangerous allure of the past, the feminine mystique and male fear of female power. Writers have reimagined her origin story, giving her sympathetic backstories that transform her from pure evil to a tragic figure. Egyptian cinema and television have also incorporated El Naddaha into horror films and dramatic series. These adaptations often modernize the setting while maintaining the core elements of the legend. A 1975 Egyptian film featured El Naddaha as a central antagonist, and more recent television productions have revisited the legend for contemporary audiences. In the age of the internet, El Naddaha has found new life in digital spaces. Egyptian horror story forums and social media pages dedicated to folklore regularly share El Naddaha tales. YouTube videos explore the legend. Urban exploration groups sometimes seek out supposedly haunted stretches of the Nile where El Naddaha sightings have been reported. There's even been discussion of El Naddaha in the context of modern feminism and gender dynamics in Egyptian society. Some contemporary interpretations view her as a symbol of female power and resistance against patriarchal structures. In this reading, El Naddaha isn't a villain but a figure who punishes men who venture into spaces they don't respect or who approach the feminine with entitlement rather than reverence. This reinterpretation transforms her from a cautionary tale for men into an empowerment symbol for women. The legend has also been studied by anthropologists, folklorists, and psychologists as a case study in how traditional beliefs persist and adapt in modernizing societies. El Naddaha appears in academic papers examining Egyptian cultural identity, the role of folklore in community cohesion, and the psychological functions of legend and myth. For Egyptian communities outside Egypt, in the diaspora, El Naddaha serves as a connection to cultural heritage. Grandparents tell the stories to grandchildren born in Europe or North America, maintaining a link to Egyptian identity even when the Nile is thousands of miles away. Interestingly, some environmental and river conservation groups in Egypt have even used El Naddaha symbolically in awareness campaigns. The message being that the Nile still has power and mystery, that it demands respect and protection. By invoking this traditional figure, they tap into deep cultural connections to the river that statistics and scientific arguments might not reach as effectively. What's particularly fascinating is how El Naddaha has maintained her power even as the context around her has changed. The Nile is no longer the mysterious, untamed force it was a century ago. It's been dammed, measured, mapped, and commercialized. Yet the legend persists. This suggests that El Naddaha represents something deeper than just fear of drowning. She embodies the relationship between humans and nature, the mystery that remains even in a world of science and technology, and the acknowledgement that some forces, whether natural or supernatural, remain beyond our complete control and understanding. Before we wrap up, I want to share one more account with you. This one was shared on an Egyptian folklore forum about 5 years ago, and the specificity and detail make it particularly compelling. The poster identified himself as Ahmed, a 32-year-old engineer who had moved to Cairo for work but was originally from a small village in the Nile Delta. He described himself as educated, skeptical, and not someone who believed in superstitions. He was visiting his family village for a wedding celebration. On the second evening of his visit, after the celebrations had died down, he decided to take a walk to clear his head. It was around 10 in the evening, and he chose a path he'd walked hundreds of times as a child, a route that ran parallel to the Nile about 50 meters from the water's edge. The night was warm, and there was a light mist rising from the river. He was listening to music through his earphones, thinking about work issues he'd left unresolved in Cairo. Then his phone died, battery completely drained. He took out his earphones and continued walking in silence. That's when he heard it, his mother's voice, calling his name from the direction of the river. But here's the detail that made this account stand out to me. He specifically noted that his mother had a very distinctive way of calling him when he was younger. She would call his name twice, with a specific rhythm and intonation that was unique to her. And that's exactly what he heard. Not just his name, but that specific pattern of calling that only his mother used. His rational mind immediately told him this was impossible. His mother was at home in the village center, at least a 15-minute walk away, and she had no reason to be by the river at night. But the sound was so accurate, so perfect in every detail, that he found himself turning toward the water. He called out, asking if someone was there. The voice responded, saying his name again with what sounded like urgency. "Come quickly. I need you." Without making a conscious decision to do so, he started walking toward the river. He described the experience as feeling like he was watching himself from outside his body. He could see himself leaving the path, walking through the tall grass toward the water, but he felt disconnected from his own actions. Then two things happened almost simultaneously. First, he stepped into a depression in the ground, a hole that caused him to stumble and nearly fall. The shock of that near fall seemed to break whatever hold had been on him. Second, he heard actual voices behind him. A group of young men from the village were walking along the path, talking and laughing. Their voices were normal, human, real. The contrast between those ordinary voices and the voice that had been calling him suddenly became clear. The voice from the river had been wrong somehow. Too perfect, too clear despite the distance, too emotionally manipulative. He scrambled back to the path, shaking. When he reached the young men, they asked if he was all right. He looked terrible apparently, pale and sweating. He asked them if they'd heard a woman's voice calling from the river. They looked at each other with expressions he couldn't quite read, a mix of concern and something else. Knowledge maybe. One of them simply said, "You heard El Naddaha. Don't go near the water tonight." When Ahmed returned to his family's house, he found his mother there, exactly where she should have been, preparing tea in the kitchen. She had not left the house. She had not called for him. Whatever voice had mimicked her so perfectly had not been her. Ahmed concluded his post by saying that he didn't know what to believe. He didn't want to think he'd had a genuine supernatural encounter. But he also couldn't explain what had happened. The voice had been too accurate. His compulsion to approach the water had been too strong. And the timing of his stumble and the appearance of other people had felt too much like intervention rather than coincidence. So what do we make of El Naddaha? Is she a real supernatural entity stalking the banks of the Nile, claiming victims who venture too close? Or is she a perfect storm of psychology, cultural narrative, environmental factors, and the very real dangers of the river, creating a legend that feels real because it addresses real fears and real dangers? Maybe the truth lies somewhere in between. Maybe what matters isn't whether El Naddaha exists in a physical, provable sense, but rather that she exists in the collective consciousness of a culture that has lived alongside one of the world's most important rivers for thousands of years. She represents the relationship between people and nature, the understanding that beautiful things can be dangerous, the wisdom that respect and caution are necessary when dealing with powerful forces. The acknowledgement that not everything can be explained or controlled. Whether you believe in supernatural entities or not, the El Naddaha legend offers valuable lessons about the power of storytelling to encode practical knowledge, about how cultures develop mechanisms to protect their members, about the universal human tendency to personify and narrativize the forces that shape our lives, and about the enduring mystery that exists even in our modern, scientific world. The next time you're near water at night and you hear something that sounds like a voice calling your name, you'll probably think of El Naddaha. And maybe, just maybe, you'll think twice before investigating. Maybe you'll stay on the path. Maybe you'll call out for others to join you. Maybe you'll trust that instinct that tells you something isn't quite right. And if that keeps you safe, does it really matter whether El Naddaha is real or not? If you enjoyed this deep dive into Egyptian folklore, make sure to hit that subscribe button because I'm exploring dark legends from around the world, and trust me, we've only scratched the surface. Next time, we're venturing into the forests of Eastern Europe to uncover a legend that makes El Naddaha look merciful by comparison. You won't want to miss it. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever experienced something near water that you couldn't explain? Do you have legends like this in your own culture? I read every comment, and your stories might just inspire the next video. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and maybe stay away from rivers at night. This has been your journey into the haunting world of El Naddaha, the siren of the Nile who still calls from the darkness, waiting for the next person who will answer.